Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to this explainer where we're unpacking one of the absolutely most vital transformations in all of human history. I mean, we use it, we work for it, and we save it every single day, right? But we rarely stop to examine how money actually evolved from just a kind of informal trading tool into this massive, highly coordinated architecture of state control. So today we're analyzing the architecture of sovereign money and really getting into how the very concept of national currency systems was formed. So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start by looking at money as state power. Then we'll move into standardizing the currency and chart the rise of central banks. After that, we'll unpack supply, demand, and fiat before finally wrapping things up with the threat of inflation. Let's get to it. Starting off with Section 1, money as state power. Now, think about this for a second. Without standardized money, state power is inherently pretty weak. I mean, if everyone is out there trading different shells or livestock or randomly sized chunks of metal, a government literally cannot coordinate markets efficiently. They can't enforce contracts on a large scale, and they definitely can't systematically collect taxes. But standardizing the money changes everything. It completely transforms a fragmented, localized barter system into a unified national economy. And this is the key takeaway here. The creation of a trusted, shared medium of exchange marks the exact historical moment that money transitioned from just a convenient local tool into a deliberate instrument of national strategy. Basically, economic efficiency and government power fundamentally depend on that shared trust. Moving right along to Section 2, standardizing the currency. Because as early states expanded their borders and got more complex, they desperately needed to fix the absolute chaos of those local marketplaces. Just compare the reality of the ancient world with the standardized solution. In those older, fragmented regions, you had this super messy mix of local coins, foreign currencies, and commodity money, which obviously caused massive pricing confusion and extreme friction. But by forcing a recognized standardized currency, a state radically reduces those transaction costs. Suddenly, buyers and sellers don't have to awkwardly negotiate exchange rates between random objects anymore. It functions just like a common language for trade. Now, this isn't just a list of historical dates. It really represents the steady, relentless accumulation of state monetary power. One of the earliest deliberate unifications actually happened way back in 221 BCE, when Emperor Qin Shi Huang standardized coinage across a newly unified China. Then, fast forward to 1694, and we see the creation of the Bank of England to manage state debt and stabilize finance. And all of this culminates in 1971 with the definitive collapse of the Bretton Woods system, which permanently changed the rules of global money. But to actually make that common language function, states had to enforce it, right? And they did that through legal tender. This is simply a recognized currency established by a central authority, like a treasury, to define the unit of account and enforce consistency. For example, early modern England used the royal mint to make sure the pound sterling was perfectly consistent, and it was backed entirely by legal tender laws, meaning if you wanted to do business or pay your taxes, you were required by law to use state money. All right, part 3, rise of central banks. You see, states eventually realized that just minting uniform coins wasn't going to cut it anymore. They actually needed an institution to actively manage the entire economy. And to manage an economy, you need monetary policy. These are the tools used by a central bank to influence economic activity and the overall money supply, things like adjusting interest rates or tweaking reserve requirements. Today, institutions like the Federal Reserve act as the primary stewards of the monetary system, and without a central authority guiding those conditions, well, modern economies would be heavily exposed to some pretty extreme volatility and financial instability. I absolutely love this analogy. Think of a central bank as the economy's thermostat. If the economic temperature rises too high and risks inflation, the central bank steps in and cools the system down, usually by raising interest rates. On the flip side, if the economy falls into a recession, they provide heat to stimulate growth by lowering those rates. It's this incredibly delicate, constant balancing act to maintain a stable environment for everyone. And that brings us to Section 4, supply, demand, and fiat, because managing that economic thermostat gets incredibly complex when money isn't tied to a physical object anymore, but is instead a fiat currency. With fiat money, value is dictated entirely by trust, supply, and demand. It's fascinating. When the money supply outpaces demand, the purchasing power decreases, which results in inflation. But conversely, if the demand for money outpaces the supply, the currency actually gains value. risking deflationary freezes in economic activity. So central banks have to continually adjust their policies to prevent those scales from tipping too far in either direction. And this balancing act became the absolute core of the global economy after 1971. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system was a total watershed event because it permanently unanchored global money from physical gold reserves. This was a huge shift. It granted central banks tremendous flexibility to manage currencies based purely on economic conditions, rather than being limited by the amount of physical metals sitting in a vault somewhere. Which leads us to our final section, the threat of inflation. Because with a super flexible money supply comes the greatest historical danger of all, the mismanagement of that supply. Let's look at this quote here because it really hits the nail on the head. A stable inflation environment acts like a reliable measuring tape. If the tape stretches unpredictably, all measurements become inaccurate. Money simply must reliably preserve its purchasing power. When a government massively overprints, that measuring tape stretches, right? And making any sort of long-term economic plans for businesses, institutions, or just regular families becomes virtually impossible. And history is literally littered with these stretched measuring tapes that ended up destabilizing entire societies. Back in the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire deliberately debased its coinage, secretly reducing the silver content just to finance state spending. Then, in the 1920s, German hyperinflation expanded the money supply so much that physical cash was practically worthless. And we saw it again in the late 2000s when Zimbabwe experienced catastrophic, uncontrolled inflation. It's a clear pattern. The results are universally devastating when the supply of money disconnects from economic reality. So national currency systems truly are an incredible achievement of state power and institutional trust. They took us all the way from chaotic, localized bartering to a massively interconnected global economy. But looking at all this leaves us with a pretty provocative question. What happens when state power is anchored to a single glittering metal? For much of modern history, the entire globe played by those rigid rules. And that is the fascinating story of the gold standard era, which we are absolutely going to explore next time. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning how the world around you is built.